so I could share just enough to feel better. Sound familiar? That's what I did a year after I got married, right?
Exactly.
I could just vomit, and sometimes I would be pretty honest, sometimes not. But either way, nobody could call me out of my crap.
Well, welcome to the True Man Podcast. Now, today we are going to touch on a subject matter that is so pervasive and addicting. I have to talk about it from time to time because your relationships, your marriage, and your life depend on whether you take action on this challenge or problem. Now, what is this problem and how do we take action on it are the subject of today's podcast: pornography, affairs, and sexual addiction. Now, you would be hard pressed to find a man who hasn't been captivated at one point by pornography. Now, it's not me saying it, it's the statistics that bear this out, and they're rough, man. But let's dive into this discussion today. So, welcome to the podcast, Logan Hufford. Logan has walked the path of many men with his addiction and has been using the tools that he has learned to fight through his addiction to help others. Logan, thank you for coming on today's podcast to share your story and being vulnerable regarding this topic.
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be able to dive in with you on this.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. Obviously, there's a story here, right? I've spoken with so many guys, and typically pornography hits at a very young age, 7, 8, 9 years old. I have heard this time and time and time again. Now, I don't know when it hit with you, but usually it's something in our youth and it triggers thoughts that they're with us for a long time, and they usually cause us to get a little out of whack with our thinking. But talk about your story and maybe your introduction to pornography and how you get to where you're at today to help other guys with this recovery process.
For sure. So I don't remember the exact age. I have arbitrarily chosen the number 9 as because it was probably okay. 8, 9 years old. This was pre-adolescence. I know, I had not gone through puberty. I didn't know how sex worked, all that. So 9 is about the age. Yeah. And so that's what I say. And when I was introduced to pornography, it was my entire, to look at it like as a story, my origin story, right?
Yeah.
Is super, super boring and relatively normal compared to, I mean, if you talk to addicts, I mean, I've talked to many folks in recovery, from sexual addiction to other, to substances and all these different things. And in most cases, there's very acute trauma. There is severe abuse that's gone. I mean, I don't need to say severe. I mean, there's abuse that's gone on, right? There's extreme severe cases of just terrible stuff that's happened. And I didn't have any of that. I took for granted as a kid, but I don't take for granted now. I never felt unloved as a kid. I never felt unsafe in my home. I never. And we weren't a perfect family. There is no such thing, right? But I was loved. I was taken care of. We were taught the right things. I was the baby of 5, very stable upbringing. And I didn't need something external to push me. I found, in my case, best believe in my home growing up, there was no Playboy or Hustler. And we're talking, if I was 9, we're talking 1999. So, there were no iPads floating around, right? I mean, it was literally JCPenney catalogs. About once a year, the big giant catalog would come through.
JCPenney and Sears catalogs. Yeah.
Right. And, 98% of that catalog is totally no problem. And yet I found the lingerie and the bikini sections of that catalog. And again, didn't know how sex worked. Didn't know how masturbation, I didn't even know what the word masturbation was.
Yeah.
But I knew I liked the feeling that I got when I would look at these pictures. So that's when the addiction started. Looking back, obviously had no clue about addiction or what was happening inside my brain.
It's interesting, Logan, I think, and I think this is an important point that you bring up. And I, it's funny how the brain works. It's funny how the devil infiltrates the brain when you're seeing these images. images like that are, were put in these catalogs, are put in these catalogs. I guess if they're still printing catalogs, occasionally we
Right.
get a small one at our house. But I mean, as a kid, I remember waiting around for the J.C. Penney's and the Sears catalogs. I mean, that was a big deal when we got them in nearly every Christmas. And I think it's fair to say that those pictures weren't put in there as any type of sexual suggestion, but the pictures were there. And the way a guy's brain is wired, it doesn't matter. It could be a Playboy or it could be a catalog. And I think a lot of us that grew up during that time frame, if we're being honest, we saw those pictures in a catalog and it changed how we thought. So
Yep.
I just want to throw that out as kind of a grace area for guys to understand that, we're hard. We love pictures. We love
Right.
seeing this stuff. Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's there's an attractiveness to that. And that in of itself is not wrong. That is
Right.
not a cause for shame. Now, what I chose to chase after as my life progressed, yeah, there's a reason for shame, but there's nothing shameful about seeing something attractive and going, oh, that was enjoyable or that was attractive or, depending on what the thing is.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it was something I talk about all the time with sexual addiction is the progression. It never,
There you go.
it
Yeah.
never stays with how it got me. The phrase, addiction will take me further than I want to go and cost me more than I wanted to pay, and hurt more people than I could ever imagine, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And even at the age of 9, 10 years old, when I look back, again, had no clue what was happening then, but when I look back, the progression was so real. So at one point, again, don't remember the age, but let's say 10 years old. Now I start looking at still photos online. So very rarely, but when I would sneak up to the computer and look at still photos. And, so it's midnight or whatever, and I'm up on the computer by myself looking at these photos of bikinis and lingerie, because those are the two things that I had trained myself, not intentionally at that stage, but I trained myself to enjoy. And I remember the first time a picture of a naked woman came on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And my response was, I was repulsed. It was ugly. I didn't like that because I'd never seen a naked woman. I had not yet taught myself that that's something that is attractive, which is very normal and healthy for a 9, 10-year-old kid. A 9, 10-year-old kid shouldn't want to look at a naked woman. Like I'm not even to this stage of puberty or anything like that. And so in that moment, it was like, there was like a healthy response in a way. And yet, of course, I quickly overcame that. Very quickly, I started to want to see that again. And so I progressed past any sort of barrier. And now it's like, okay, now bikinis aren't enough. Now I want to see the real thing. I want to see a naked woman, which then went to videos, hardcore pornography. Around the age of 14 or so, I was introduced to masturbation. Buddy taught me how to masturbate, and so started masturbating. And that was like, oh my gosh.
Hold on here. A buddy told you how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, literally, and I want to be very, very clear. I mean, this was not, I mean, it wasn't healthy. This was not an abuse situation. He didn't do anything to me.
Yeah.
But it was, we were out camping. And he was like, I don't remember. I'm not going to pretend that I remember the exact how it played out, but basically he was like, oh, you don't know how to do that? He's like, oh yeah, let me show you. And he showed me. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, because literally in my mind, I'm like, well, I've had these pent up feelings for literally years now, 5, 6 years of lusting and objectifying women. And I didn't know what to do with them. And now I'm like, oh, great, sweet, sign me up.
Yeah.
And so once I discovered that, I mean, it took my addiction to a whole nother level, because now, okay, sweet, I can really get some good stuff from this.
Yeah.
And that's how I felt. The hardcore
funny
videos,
how those endorphins in the brain begin to, all that chemicals in the brain start working.
No, the dopamine hits. Just as a quick aside, I mean, because I'll talk a bit about the science and how that works. So that's a huge part of it.
Yeah,
I'm not a scientist. I've not spent any time in a lab. I've learned a lot of things through books and studies and stuff like that. if somebody wants to learn more about this from a scientific angle, especially, um, it's a Christian resource, but they dive really deep into the science. The Conquer series, put on by Ted Roberts and Pure Desire Ministries, is an incredible series. So a guy struggling, maybe a spouse, maybe just a pastor, that wants to understand this better. The Conquer series, I cannot recommend that enough.
Got it.
So that's an incredible resource. So progressed, in my teen years to, okay, now I'm looking at porn, like hardcore porn, people having sex, sexual acts, masturbating to it, can't get enough of it. Like, still, living in a sheltered home where I could only get it so often, but every chance I could, I would take it. And all this time, I'm very insecure. I'm very shy around girls, not around other people, but I'm shy around girls because I always thought I was ugly and nobody would ever like me. And so it was all channeled through, pornography and masturbation. And as I got older in my teen years, I started to get a little bit of attention from girls, and okay, maybe a girl would like me. And so I started the flirting a bit. I started seeking attention from girls. It was still pretty limited looking back. And that's a relative term, but it was pretty limited. It was still mostly pornography. And when I was 18 years old, 18 and 19, because I turned 19 the summer of 2009, I had like my prodigal son moment. Went down to Houston, Texas for work. I grew up in Alaska, went down to Houston, Texas. So now I'm no longer living with my family, no longer, in this infrastructure, this like kind of, relatively healthy greenhouse, right? Now I'm down by myself with a bunch of dudes, living in an apartment, working. And I just went hog wild, chased after everything that I couldn't do before. So I'm partying, I'm drinking, I'm, having sexual encounters with girls. I'm mixing all of those things together, which that became a big part of my addiction. Was any chance I could mix alcohol or drugs with sexual encounters. That was a big, big deal for me. That also infiltrated the type of porn that I would watch.
Yeah.
So that was a big shift. Now I'm starting to play these things out, and a big part of my addiction that maybe wouldn't look so bad to like an external viewer was, in addition to that stuff, I started to become what I call myself, that I was a predator, not from a legal standpoint, but I was a predator in the sense that I was, what any female that would cross my path, I started to go after whatever attention I could get. And at this point, usually that looked like I would flirt and see if I could get them to flirt back. I would text them, and try to have, an inappropriate texting conversation. Sometimes it would lead to physical encounters, but I was just craving whatever attention I could get. And I was learning the types of people that in my unhealthy brain were easy prey, were vulnerable. And so I mean, I don't hold back from saying, and especially as my story goes on, I was an absolute predator. I thought it was cool. I thought it was a player.
Yeah. Did you have any negative thought towards that at that point, or you're
not
just
at that
like,
point?
This is all about the catch?
Not really at that point.
Yeah.
Now okay. So one thing I talked a little bit about my upbringing, something to share, just so we can kind of do like a spiritual check on where Logan was at this point. So I grew up going to church every Sunday.
Yeah.
Believing in God. I don't think there's ever been a day in my life, Mike, where I didn't believe that God was real, that God created the universe, that Jesus was a real man who came down to earth, who died on the cross for my sins. Like, I always believed that those things were true. I never doubted those things. I always believed in heaven and hell. But relationship with Christ, never felt that. I got baptized and I, prayed the prayer and all that.
Yep.
Doubted my salvation for years and years. So at this point, like when I was in Houston, Texas, I remember I still went to church most Sundays. Part of that was probably muscle memory. I went to church every Sunday, and yet I had to work hard. I didn't have a car. I had to get a ride there. So, I mean, I did have to go out of my way to get there. And I remember some of those Sundays, especially as the summer progressed and my behavior got more and more depraved. There was one Sunday where literally, there wasn't really Uber. I don't even know if Uber existed. I took a taxi to my apartment and then caught a ride to church. And I'd been out partying with this girl all night, hadn't slept at all. And I wanted to change my clothes, didn't even get a chance to change my clothes. So I'm in church, just smelling like all this stuff, feeling like all this stuff. And I remember this feeling of like, okay, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to have a relationship with Christ. I don't know what these people think of me, but again, I believe in God. I believe in the truth of Christianity. And so it was like, let me at least be close to people that have a relationship with Christ.
Mm.
And I remember that very vividly. They weren't pews, they were chairs, but sitting in those pews or whatever, and just going, I don't have what they have, and I know that, and I feel really bad about that. But let me sit close to them because that makes me feel a
funny
little
thing
bit
of it
better.
is they were probably sitting there thinking the same thing, Logan.
Yeah, and well, yeah, who knows, right? I mean, I always felt
Yeah.
I'm the only one that's doing this. I'm the only one, right? And
I
of course,
spent
those feelings
9
only
years in
progressed.
Houston, so you and I may have to compare some notes after this podcast is over. So
It's insane that worse things didn't happen down there. I mean, literally just from a legal standpoint, physical standpoint. I mean, just I got myself in some trouble. I should have gotten myself in so much more trouble down there. So I came back up to Alaska, and in my head, I'm like, okay, like I had my fun, and I'd like to have more of that, but okay, like I'm glad I got that out of my system. It was kind of the thought,
you
and
actually thought you had it out of your system, huh?
to an extent, I probably wouldn't have. I didn't have that fully formed thought, but I think there was
Yeah.
like a feeling more than a thought. There was a feeling of like, all right, I had my fun, cool. Because there were also, I mean, even as an 18, 19-year-old kid, I mean, or guy, I mean, there were parts of it that even at that young age were very obviously ridiculously destructive. At one point, I would, I hate the term hookup. I feel like it's really minimizing of what it is. But for lack of a better word, I was hooking up with this one lady, and for a while that summer, Houston's a big area, right?
Yeah.
Uh, whenever I would have the chance, I would borrow my buddy's car, and I would drive across Houston, and I would party with her, and then I would drive back. I worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. And so I would, 10 o'clock at night, drive like an hour and a half, go see her, party with
I
her
was
all
just going to
night.
say, when you said Houston, I was like, in my mind, I went, he just said he went on a 60-mile drive.
Right. And I would
That's
drive back
true.
across. And then, so I'm not sleeping at all. Sometimes I would, try to get like a 30-minute little nap.
Yeah.
So even at 19 years old, it was obvious to me, like, this is not sustainable. This is not going to work
Yeah.
out long term, but let me get my kicks when I can, right? Like, that's where my head was at.
Yeah.
So I came back to Alaska, and again, to an external viewpoint, I kind of went back to being like the good boy. Like, I'm living with my parents again, going to church on Sundays,
Mm.
still struggling with porn, but we lived several miles outside of town. So there was no sneaking out of the house. There was no having
Yeah.
girls come over. And a few months into my time back in Alaska, towards the end of 2009, met a young lady at work. And I'll tell you one of the most attractive things about her. She was very physically attractive. One of the most attractive things about her was she was a Christian, and she was open about that she was a new believer.
Mm.
And like, that probably sounds insane. Like, I just told you all these things I was doing for the last several months. And yet that truly was a very attractive piece, because the truth of like believing in God and all that never left me, even though I wouldn't say I was a Christian. I wouldn't say that I had but I knew that that was a good thing. Like that was a
Yeah, I
good
was
thing to
just going to
chase
say,
after.
the most interesting part about your story as you're telling it is it always goes back to the church, always in some fair to say small way goes back to Christ. Like he's trying to wedge himself in there some way, right?
And I've actually never shared this on a podcast before. I don't usually share it in an interview or in my testimony. But I think it's relevant here. I mean, to a parent, any parent that if you're listening, whether you've got kids around that age, or you've got little kids, or you're going to be a parent one day. My mom, I mean, she's not perfect, right? But like, could she be a little overbearing at times? Yeah. But she would remind me how much she was praying for me. She would always remind me. So did I not want to hear from her at many times? Oh yeah. Did I want to hear way less about some of the stuff that she was? Yeah, I didn't want to hear that. But you better believe in some of these dark times, I knew she was praying for me. And that kind of almost maybe sounds cliche, and you're just like, hey,
Oh
that's a
no,
powerful thing. She never stopped praying for me. So I mean, just because you brought it up, you're absolutely right. Like, she never stopped praying. God continually put people around to plant
yeah,
seeds. Um, the, there was the church that I grew up going to and still attended for several years after when I came back to Alaska. Relatively small and but stable church, and one of the pastors there, he would take me out for breakfast and coffee and stuff, and he tried to mentor me, and I mean, I was polite, but like I completely rejected him in terms of I didn't want to hear. I would listen to his advice and listen to his feedback and be the good boy. But I really didn't do anything that he said. I wasn't vulnerable to him, and yet like I've gone back to him and I have apologized for these things and I've shared all, and I told him like God used you. God used that man
yeah,
to
for
plant
sure.
seeds in me, even though
Right.
I can't imagine how frustrated he must have been, going like, Logan, are you kidding me? But God used him to plant seeds, even
Yeah.
though he wasn't the one that got to pick the fruit, but he planted the seeds. Um, so, in this time, late '09, I eventually start dating this girl, Carrie. And basically I felt like I was getting better. I stopped looking at porn nearly as much. No, I shouldn't say stopped. I started looking at porn a lot less, would be the accurate
Yeah.
way to put it. Um, and I told her, I struggle with porn. Um, but to that point, infidelity was not something that like I hadn't been in a stable relationship to be unfaithful to someone. So I hadn't been unfaithful at that point.
You're right.
So it was like, okay, I struggle with porn, but okay. Like, so I went to, some, the Stephen Arterburn, Every Man's Battle. I went to, one of those classes and read the book, and, I'm working on it. I'm trying to do it less and, started doing it a little bit less, and like, I'm doing better. Realistically, what happened was I took all of these unhealthy feelings and behaviors and thoughts, and I was funneling them towards her with infatuation. So
Uh,
my lust manifested as infatuation for a while, which to me felt pretty decent and wholesome compared to partying all night, right?
right.
And yet nothing was fixed, right? Nothing had been healed. And so we dated
It's just kind of a
pretty.
different form of lust. Is that, I mean, is
Oh,
that,
100%. Yeah.
yeah.
It's absolutely, it
And
was a
I do
different
think that's
form.
important to point out because, that's really, I think, for the most part, what some of these things that start innocently from pornography, it really like it manifests itself in lust. And we teach ourselves, or how we learn is from that perspective. And it's almost like we have to unlearn that in
Yep.
order to have love and true intimacy, I believe. So I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I
No, no,
just thought
no, you're
that was a
good. I mean,
good point to
it
jump in there and say, hey, lust manifests itself in a lot of different ways.
and another word that we can use, they're not the same thing, but they share a lot of connective tissue, is idolatry, right? Now, again,
Sure.
like, was I even a Christian? I mean, realistically, I probably wasn't even saved at that point, even though I would have said that I was. But like, I was placing Carrie as my girlfriend and then my fiance. I was placing her as the most important thing. Technically, reality, no, I was placing my own sexual desires.
Right.
But because she was the face of my sexual desires, I felt like I was doing better. And that continued for several months. And then I don't remember like a date or even the month, but before we ever got married, I cheated on her for the first time. And at this time, I was a car salesman. So I sold cars for 6 years, from August of 2010, July of 2016. And in those 6 years, I was a really good car salesman. Not because I was the slickest and smartest salesman. I was good at building relationships. I was good at building rapport. I was good at getting people to like me and open up to me.
Sure.
I was a manipulator. I was, as a teenager, I was like a baby manipulator. I was like again, as a predator, like, okay, like I was a little lion cub. I was, trying to learn things.
Mm.
Well, by the time 2010, 2011 rolled around, I was like a full on adult, adult lion, out there hunting. And so the first time I cheated on my fiance at that point, it was this dam broke, because I never thought I would do that. Never thought I would. It wasn't like, oh, I would like to, but I don't know if I, am brave enough. Like, no, I wouldn't ever do that. And then I did. And because when I would sell a car, meet a woman through work, I did all the things that I did as a teenager. I would text them, and I would flirt, and I'd do these, and I would do just enough to get, if there's a reaction. And then if there was nothing, I could always pull back and like, oh, that, I wasn't doing anything. I was just talking. I was just joking.
Yeah.
But then if they would give me any sort of response, then I would go a step further and a step further. And again, I very quickly learned who would be a good target, which is I want to make extremely clear. That's an extremely unhealthy way to think, but that's how I thought of it. That's what my MO was. And so I would chase after and take whatever I could take from any woman in my path. Most of them, never went beyond fantasy or flirting. Some went to inappropriate texting, and then some, quite a few eventually over the years, eventually went to the point of actual sexual contact, whether having sex or something else. And she didn't know about this. We got married, and we're staying up there giving our vows, and I knew that I'd cheat on her multiple times. I remember giving my vows, and this isn't like, oh, I'm just gonna keep doing all this stuff because it's so much fun. Even at that point, I hated that I'd done it. I didn't want to keep doing it. But I remember telling her in my vows, some version of, I know I'm going, I basically, like, throughout life, I know things are not going to be perfect. And we were telling her, and I know I'm going to hurt you.
Ooh.
But I will always, I will always, be connected to you, or always walk with you, or some version of that. And I didn't mean that as like, I'm going to cheat on you, but I think there was part of me that absolutely subconsciously meant that. And of course she didn't take it that way, right? She took it as like, oh, he's being so raw and so honest. But I think there was a subconscious part of me that was like, dude, you've cheated on her multiple times already. You're probably going to do it again.
Yeah. I mean, was there a point as you prepare to get married where you're like, dude, what are you doing? You can't be faithful. I mean, was that there, or was there, screw it. I've gotten by with it at this point.
I had pretty well lied to myself to think that I cannot do it, because I've heard so many guys say this. So for me, this kind of is a cliche. And yet, if you're listening, maybe you've never heard this before. Maybe you didn't realize that other people have had this thought. I thought that I wouldn't struggle with these things once we were married, because I could have sex with my wife whenever I wanted.
Just turn it off. Yeah.
Right. Complete ludicrous thinking. That's not how the brain works. That's not how muscle memory works.
Nope.
But that's how I thought it would happen. I will tell you though, my oldest brother, he sat me down one time. It wasn't like right the night before our wedding or anything, but it was, I think it was before we were engaged or shortly after we got engaged. And my family didn't want me to get married, not because of Carrie. They loved Carrie. They were like, dude, you're not ready to be married. And they didn't know about this stuff.
They knew it.
Right. They didn't know, but they knew, right?
Yeah.
They knew I was immature and selfish.
Yeah.
My own sister one time sat me down. She said, Logan, you have sociopathic tendencies.
Oh, wow.
And I was so ticked at her. I was like, are you kidding me? What is wrong with you? Is completely accurate. I
Yeah.
didn't even realize that that's what it was. And she saw, and again, she didn't know these things that I had done. She didn't even know about Houston. I had told my brothers of like, hey, like, this kind of crazy episode in my life happened. And so my oldest brother sat me down. He's 9.5 years old, or yeah, about 9.5 years older than me. And he's like, Logan, you've told me that, you've had some experiences with girls and everything. And, you had, like, by your own admission, you didn't really care about those girls. He's like, you're telling me you care about this girl. You're telling me you love this girl. You're telling me you want to marry this girl. And I mean, God gave him a lot of insight in this conversation. Cause again, he didn't know this conversation that might have been before I actually cheated on Carrie. I don't remember. But my brother knew that these seeds had been planted, right? Like these evil seeds. And he was like, you're going to hurt her. And I just was, I appreciated that he was trying to be a loving older brother but I completely missed the boat. So we got married. I cheated on her multiple times. And within the first year, cheated on her again. We got pregnant in that first year. Our son Elijah was born Cinco de Mayo, 2012. Just had his birthday. And about a year after we got married, I had several sexual encounters, cheated on my wife several times. And again, I'm just going to say this. I say this quite a bit. When I use verbs like sexual encounters, I'm not being vague to minimize or hide. I'm trying not to be graphic and triggering, but
Sure.
I'm absolutely not trying to be vague to shy away from what I did. That's not the intent at all. And I felt so bad. I hated it. Again, just like when I stood up there, like I hated that I had done these things. And I'm like, all right, well, golly, I had better stop. And so I need to confess these things to Carrie. So I did. And I wrote her a letter, and I wrote in this letter.
Yeah.
I don't remember the verbiage, but I confessed that I did cheated on you multiple times. And I don't remember how I laid it out, but I told her that. Now, part of it was, okay, I'm confessing my sins and I'm sharing this, and I'm trying to do the right thing. A big part of it though, Mike, it made me feel better because I got it off my chest.
You got it off. Yeah.
I vomited on her.
Yeah.
And it's like, I was able to walk away and go, hey, I feel better. Hey, I feel like I got it out there and I'm not hiding anything. Meanwhile, she's trying to clean up vomit off her face. Right.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not how I thought about it in the moment.
Yeah.
And I would end up, I would go on to give her multiple, what we call staggered confessions, where none of them were ever the end of anything. And then reality was all of these confessions were, in hindsight, they were very limited because I wasn't confessing to the texting. I wasn't confessing to the flirting that never went anywhere. All I was confessing to was like the worst of the worst. They weren't true confessions, and they weren't followed up by any difference in behavior. There's a phrase that we use in recovery. Not like we invented it, but we use it all the time, of false resolve. And it usually is that, between acting out, whether it's porn, having sex with another woman, whatever, there's this feeling of like, I'm never going to do that again. I feel so bad. And false resolve is, I want a different outcome. I hope things happen differently in the future. And yet my behavior never changes. My routines never change. My infrastructure never changes, as opposed to real resolve, which is like, okay, I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to do things differently now. I'm going to interact with the world differently. I'm going to interact with people differently. I'm going to invite counsel and feedback differently. I'm kind of jumping ahead in my story because eventually God brought me to a point where that happened. But at this point, it was all false resolve. It was all, man, that's terrible. I don't want to do that, but I'm not going to do anything differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is the mistake that men make, not just in sexual addiction, but really any addiction that they come across. Right. I mean, addiction is really does the same thing in the brain. And, I think that a lot of us will say things like, I'm just going to stop, cold turkey. And it just does not work that way.
So let me put this out there to you as well. And if you're listening and you're not familiar with addiction, or maybe, because this is pretty common in the church. This is how I felt. The word addiction maybe it turns you off. It's like, especially because there's a phrase that's used in
Yeah.
addiction recovery,
Yeah.
powerless to stop. Like, that's part of the 12 steps, is I admitted I had a problem and that I was powerless to stop it. Well, I remember hearing that before I ever even knew what recovery was. I remember hearing that type of verbiage. And this is a really common thought with a lot of Christians is, well, that's an excuse. That means you're not taking ownership. That means you're blaming it on your addiction. You're blaming it on a disease and that kind of. And I get where they're coming from, because that's how I used to feel. And so I always give this little analogy that for me, it makes a lot of sense, is I got myself to this point where I got in a deep, dark cave of sexual addiction. And it was like hell on earth.
Yeah.
Every
Sure.
single step I took to get to the mouth of the cave, to walk into the cave, to walk deeper into the cave, I took those steps, and I'm responsible for taking those steps. And I knew that I was taking a step forward each time. And yet there was also a point where I go, oh crap, I'm in the middle of this deep, dark cave and I don't know how to get out. I don't even know if I can get out. So
Right.
both of those things are simultaneously true. Yes, I am responsible for my choices, and I will never hide from that. I own that. I took those choices. I took those steps. And yet I was also at a point where I couldn't just toggle switch off. I'm not going to do it anymore just cuz. That's
Yeah.
not how the brain works. That's not, I mean,
No.
scientifically, that is not how we work. And as I'll share, I mean, God gave me the tools to get out of that cave, but it wasn't just from going, I'm going to decide not to do things that I've literally trained myself to do for, the last 15 years. And all that, well, that didn't start yet, but what happened was in 2015. So we were kind of jumping ahead a little bit here, but 2015. So we've got several years now, right, of affairs and constant porn use and constant flirting and just totally unhealthy behavior. In 2015, we've got 3 kids now.
Yeah.
My wife is pregnant. So my wife, Carrie, is pregnant with our 4th boy. And I had another affair. And she would tell you that this was, out of all this pain and trauma, this was the most hurtful affair. For one, because unlike a lot of these other encounters, this was a true affair. This was a month-long, I mean, I had a double life the whole time, but this was a complete, like, this was a very acute version of a double life where I was interacting with this woman for an entire month and just all this stuff. And it was somebody that my wife knew about. She knew that there was some sort of inappropriate texting or something. She knew
Yeah.
that, and she had called me out on it. And of course I lied and I gaslit her and all these things. So it was unlike the other ones. Not that one was better or worse, but it was even deeper, the deceit, and it was even longer. And so I had this affair, and she did something she'd never done before. And she gave me an ultimatum. She said, Logan, if you don't get help and make some serious change, then I will be leaving, and me and the kids are gone. And that freaking scared me.
Yeah.
I absolutely believed her. She's not the type of person to just speak rashly. And so that was the first landmark in our story where things started to shift. So this was July, at the end of July, or maybe the start of August of 2015. And I didn't get sober until May 19th, 2016 is my sobriety date. So there's almost an entire year of still basically playing around, is how I would term it, because I wasn't getting serious. But I started to do things differently. I started to go to meetings. I started to try to find some tools. It took me a while to get traction, but God used her to speak to me differently, to treat me differently. And then over the next several months, again, barely any traction, or maybe no traction at some points. But I was trying to, I was kind of groping around the cave going, okay, let me try to find a way out. Whereas before I'm just actively walking forward. Right. So I'm still in the cave. I'm still kind of walking forward, but every once in a while I'm checking for a way out. And I met a guy named Rick. at a Celebrate Recovery group. And I got a lot of love. I have a lot of love for CR. I'm not here to bash any other group, but at least the CRs that I've attended, it's very common in 12-step groups is, I share, I get current or get grounded or whatever you want to call it. I share how my week has been or what my story is or how my day has been. And then the next guy goes,
yeah,
you're not allowed to give me feedback. You're not allowed to ask me clarifying questions. You're not allowed to give me advice. So what can I do? I can show up and I can go boo-hoo, poor me. I can go, oh my gosh, I'm such a terrible person. I can share, oh, I'm doing pretty good, whatever. Doesn't matter. You're not allowed to speak into my life. You're not allowed to speak into my decisions. So I could share just enough to feel better. Sound familiar? That's what I did a year after I got married,
yeah,
right? I could
exactly.
just vomit and sometimes I would be pretty honest, sometimes not. But either way, nobody could call me out of my crap. And so, but going back to that first CR I ever went to, though, after the meeting, there's maybe 20 guys. Most of the guys were there for substance abuse and that kind of thing. And one guy, Rick, said, he and I both were there, recovering sex addict. He was like, Logan, I'm really glad you're here. Appreciate you coming. I think you need more than this group. He goes, I needed more than this group. At this point, he was several years sober, decade or so. He's like an older guy. He's my dad's age. He's like, there's this group called Prodigals. And he's like, maybe I'd love to take you there, meet some guys. There is real healing there. He goes, it's hard work. It was like boot camp when I did it. He's like, I hated it, but I needed it. And I totally was like, okay, that sounds like something I don't want. That sounds really hard. And I don't
Funny
need
how
that.
a guy a few miles down the road can sniff somebody out, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example of of what that could look like. So at one point, this was maybe a couple weeks or a couple months after having met him. So again, I'm going to CR meetings about every week. And I'm just sharing kind of as much as I need to share or want to share to feel better. And at one point I told him, I said, hey, Rick, and I'm in my head, I'm like, I'm ready to get serious. I'm ready to really do this thing. And I was like, hey, Rick, maybe we could get together for coffee, a couple times a month. And we can work on this. And Rick he's become a father to me. He has become a grandpa to my kids, and he has become my best friend outside of Carrie. Rick looked at me dead in the eye. He goes, Logan, if you want to get together for coffee every now and again, I don't have time for you. And that hurt my feelings. That offended me. I didn't like that. That was the second time somebody treated me lovingly, but in a way that I'd never been treated, not in a long time.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, in some ways, not since that conversation with my brother, right before I got married. He spoke the truth. He quickly followed that up, though. He said, if you want to seriously work on things, I will help you. I will walk with you. But it's not going to be getting together for coffee every now and again. Like, we're going to be doing some heavy work, and it's going to be intense. And yeah, you're going to hate me. He's like, you're going to hate the work. You're going to hate it.
Yeah.
But if you're really wanting to get this thing kicked, then I will walk with you. And so I still kept him at arm's length for a while. But I finally went to him, Prodigals meeting. So at this point, I'm living in Wasilla, Alaska, which is an hour north of Anchorage, Alaska. It's basically a suburb, even though it's an hour north. And we went to a Prodigals meeting in Anchorage. And this was March of 16 when I went to my first Prodigals meeting. Still wasn't sober, right? Still took a couple months to even get sober. But God, this was another landmark because God showed me something that I never thought was possible. When I got to that meeting, or I guess after the meeting, I had sat down, I'd gotten a chance to meet some guys. So there's like 20 guys at this meeting, and they're all there for sexual addiction recovery, whether they're there to give back, they're there to get their own healing, or somewhere in between. And out of those like 20 guys, probably half of them had basically my story, some variation of my story, years of depravity, years of sexual addiction. And they had 5 years, 10 years. Some guys had 15, 20 years. I had lunch with a guy yesterday who was one of my closest friends and closest mentors, celebrating 50 years of marriage. And he had my story.
How did it feel to be around those guys and know that
hope?
Hope. I didn't even need to finish the question.
No, Mike, I never had hope. And again, this is not me trying to woe is me. Like, yeah, again, I took
Yeah.
those steps into the cave. I took those steps.
Yeah.
But you better believe there were points where I'm going, yeah, it's my fault that I'm here, but I freaking hate it here and I don't want to be here anymore. And I don't know how to get out. And I never thought that there could be hope because I'm not stupid. Like, I've cheated on my wife so many times. I've trained myself to basically prey on and abuse every woman that I'm around. Like, I wasn't unaware of the fact that again, I didn't know how the science worked, but I knew
Yeah.
like these are not light things. These are not just quick choices. These are habits that I had built into myself over years. So, relationship with Christ, done. I've signed that away. There's no way I can have that. Um, a good marriage, done. I can't do that. This is what hope looked like for me before that meeting. I would like to have less affairs. That would be hope. Mike, I'm not making this up. I remember thinking this.
Yeah.
Maybe I can stop having affairs and I can only have like the porn and the flirting. That would be awesome.
Yeah. These
And
crazy agreements that we make with ourselves, right?
100%, because there's no way I can just stop all this stuff together. And so when I sat down and I got to meet those guys and go, okay, I don't know how they did it. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it, but I'm willing to try.
Yeah.
And so starting in May, I started in a prodigals mentorship program, which there's a weekly meeting. And then there's the mentorship program, which is an elective, basically voluntary house arrest. And for 2 years, I was mentored very closely by Rick and by a group of men. Rick was my primary mentor, sponsor, and signed away a lot of freedoms, gave a lot of things up. And some guys have to give things up that I didn't even have to give. I mean, some guys, had to change jobs or, move and things like that if they're going to be in the program because of, wherever their life has taken them. But basically, it's like, okay, Logan, had for years done things my way, right? I'd done things the way that felt good to me. I'd done things the way that my impulses told me to, and things didn't turn out so hot. So it was like God going, okay, we're done with, we're not doing the Logan route anymore. We're going to do it the God route. And these are men that I've put in your life. And it wasn't that they told me exactly what to do all the time.
Yeah.
Very few times did they say, Logan, you need to do this. But they dug and they poked and they prodded and they asked me tough questions and they held my feet to the fire. And they didn't let me get away with my BS. They didn't let me be this conniving, manipulative sociopath, that I was for years.
Logan, as we begin to wrap up today, I do have a couple of questions for you. One, what an incredible story, really, of redemption for sure. Tell everybody where you're at today in this process and how you're doing. And then I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure. So I'm coming up on 8 years of sobriety, and beyond that, I got into recovery. I first attended any of these meetings. I first got into the mentorship program only for one reason. It wasn't to grow closer to God. Not because I didn't want that. I couldn't have that. That wasn't for me. That's how I felt. I only did it to try and save my marriage, to try and stop cheating. And God gave me that. But he did so much more. I mean, he transformed our marriage. I tell people all the time, God did not save our marriage. He ripped our marriage down and then he rebuilt a new one. We didn't get divorced and remarried, but spiritually and routine and behavior wise, absolutely. It's a new marriage. It's a new relationship.
Well, yeah. So I'm gonna stop you right there, and I'm gonna ask you about your wife, who must be a patron saint, to put up with your crap, right? And then be there. But she was there for you every step of the way because she wanted to see that healing. She knew that guy, that heart of the guy inside, right? So talk about your wife a little bit. I mean,
well, I completely get where you're coming from, but I'm gonna, for the sake of you listening, Mike, I'm gonna push back on one thing you said.
Go.
So she's an incredible person. She's an incredible, strong, loving woman, obviously. And I'm so thankful that she was willing to see me through my healing.
Yeah.
And yet the miracle wasn't that she stuck with me. The miracle was that in 2015, she had the strength to stand up to her abuser and say,
Ah,
Logan, I can't
beautiful.
stop you. I can't
Yeah.
control you. But if you continue to hurt me like this, then you will lose me. Because that was the one thing she could control, right? She couldn't fix me. She
Yeah.
couldn't heal me. She tried to be, and she would tell you this. She tried for those years to be sexier, to be more available, to be a better wife, to be a better. It was never about her, Mike. It was
Yeah.
about how I had trained
Yep.
myself
Yep.
and given over
Yep.
to sin.
Yeah. Boy, you just hit the nail on the head right there. And we have this training that goes on in our lives, and it affects far more than we think. Far more than we
Yeah.
think. And a lot of times that training that we've undergone wasn't training we went out looking for in the first place, right?
Right.
I mean, it just popped up. The evil one is always around. And, part of the reason I believe that had that struggle in your marriage, and I say this to a lot of people, but the devil knows that if he can take out the head of the family, that he can take the family out. And so we need to be cognizant of that, as these little things, they seem like little things, but they're not little things, right? I mean, these addictions that pop
No.
up along the way that we bring with us into the marriage, they're just damn hard to stop
Yep.
when you get into the marriage. And so, it's important that we find ways to take care of it. So as we wrap up today,
Yeah.
boy, I could go on this all day. It's really fascinating. Tell everybody, Logan, how people can get a hold of you and how you're helping guys, get through some of the same things that you went through. How can they get a hold of you?
Sure. So I'll give you a website wherein folks can reach
Sure.
out
Yeah.
through that. I do want to make it clear. I mean, I'm not here. I don't have a book or a course. I don't coach men through sexual addiction for a living. This is not what I do for my job. I lead a men's group. I lead a prodigals chapter out in the valley. But it's, obviously if somebody were to reach out, I'm not going to promise that, I can walk with you for the next few years. That's not realistic.
Sure.
But I can respond to questions. I can point them to resources.
Absolutely.
The way I would term it is this: if a guy is willing to reach their hand out of the pit, I can be one of the hands that reaches out to them, even if I'm not going to be the guy that walks with them for the next, chapter of their life. So
Fair enough.
I'll give
Yeah.
you a website, prodigalsofalaska.com, and folks can reach out to me through that. There's also, I'll give you an email that folks can reach out to myself or to Carrie. If you are somebody who has been hurt by a man struggling with sexual addiction, and you want to ask Carrie a question, or you want to reach out, get on a phone call with her, you can do that. Again, this isn't what we do for a living, but this is our
Right.
life. This is our passion.
Yeah. It becomes your life, right?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get a chance to go into, the recovery side for women, but just I'll take like 10 seconds here. So Carrie got into recovery right after me. She got into recovery in July of 16, and recovery for the trauma of my sexual betrayal, my emotional and verbal abuse that I put her through. That's because that's not a light thing, right? I mean, she was
Right.
abused by me for years, and this is more than 10 seconds. And I've seen a lot of guys who I know very deeply who they have changed, and their lives have been transformed, but their wives have chosen to not embrace recovery. And I understand it logically, because they're
Yeah.
like, they wouldn't say this probably, but it's like, I mean, some women have said it. Hey, I didn't cheat on us. I'm not the one who did this. I don't need to why would I need to go to a group or do homework or take time out of my day? You're the one who screwed things up. And it's like, yeah, it's not the woman's fault. It's not my wife's fault, but she was wounded. If I'm wounded,
Yep.
I need to do whatever I can to try to find healing. And so I'm so thankful she got into recovery. Now she leads a group for women, that have been hurt in that way.
Solid. You, we'll put, I'll get the email addresses. We'll put them in the chat. That's where,
Okay.
in the show notes, excuse me, not the chat.
Sure.
We'll put it in the show notes, and we'll share it with everybody so they can find it in the show notes. Logan, thank you so much for telling your story. I think one of the reasons, as I was sharing with you before we began, that we do the podcast is I think these stories are incredibly valuable, because so many guys, so many families, so many women really, when they're going through stuff, they feel they're alone. And it's sometimes hard to imagine that somebody else has gone through the same thing. And what a relief, and you use the word hope, to find out that there was actually, somebody out there that had gone through it and fought through the other side. And that to
Right.
me is part of the reason we do this podcast, is to be able to share those stories so that people can find that hope. And so thank you for coming on and telling your story. I greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care, Logan.
Thanks, Mike.